Okay.
You try to pin this.
Oh, do you want me to?
Do you know how to pin it?
Yeah.
Well. That's it.
A little bit terrifying talking to myself. There you go. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to Adam and others for inviting me to speak this evening. My name is Maggie Chapman, and before I wreck the joint, I'll just say a few words about where I come to this discussion this evening. I'm the Scottish Greens MSP for the Northeast of Scotland region, and I was elected 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago. I think my election in May 2021, indeed the election of any Green in the Northeast, which includes the oil and gas capital of the UK, if not of Europe, was quite a feat, especially at a time when the fossil fuel propaganda machine was in full flow. They'd been working in overdrive because of a pretty bruising couple of years following climate strikes around the world, ensuring, you know, the activism of Greta Thunberg and others like her, other young people leading the way. And I'm mindful that it's been quite some time since I was a young person, but I'll say more about that in a moment. I'm also Gramscian, so it's nice to follow Bennett's analysis of fossil fuel hegemony in speaking this evening. We know that the world is on fire. We've seen the hottest years on record. We've witnessed the worst droughts in living memory in some parts of the world. And we're living through flooding events that are becoming increasingly frequent and severe right on our doorsteps here. And the failure of politicians to act for decades has led us to this point. Politicians have failed in other ways too, not just in failing to act to mitigate the climate emergency. We failed to act to protect our rainforests from exploitation. We failed to prevent plant and animal species from being brought to, or indeed tipped over, the brink of extinction. We failed to secure food for all of our people to eat and shelter to keep all of our people safe. We failed to create and maintain peace around the world. We failed to secure accessible health, social care, and education for all. Now, none of these things comes down to politics alone. We all know only too well the vested interests of the status quo, in business as usual, in the structures and systems that keep oppressing and scapegoating, while some, a few already very powerful people become even more powerful and wealthier. We see that only too clearly today with BP releasing its figures about its recent profits, £2.2 billion of profits in the last 3 months of its operation. So yeah, politics has failed to deal with the crises we face. But we also know that politics can, when done well, deliver for people. We know that politics, particularly when done well and in cooperation with some of the other structures and systems in our society, can change the world and change it for the better. We can see the evidence of this clearly in a range of examples. Politics working with the medical profession to get HPV vaccines to girls to radically reduce, if not eliminate, cervical cancer. Politics was necessary to overcome those arguing against vaccination because they thought the threat of STIs and cancer would deter young girls and young women having sex. We can see further evidence in how LGBT rights became unremarkable for many, at least until recently, with politics acting against structures of prejudice and oppression and bigotry. We see evidence of how politics has directed action to tackle child poverty in Scotland, in stark contrast, perhaps, with the different political decisions and structures elsewhere in the UK. Have we fixed it? No, but I think we can see the influence, the positive influence and impact that politics can have. So politics, the structures of democracy, of participation, of representation. Politics does not stand alone in how we design our world. Democracy, participation, representation is not immune to influence by big money or mass media. Politics, that democracy, that participation and representation, therefore, I believe is absolutely fundamentally necessary to ensure we deal with the climate crisis we face. But it is not sufficient on its own. It's necessary, but not sufficient. If politics is about anything, it's about power, and perhaps more specifically, how to deal with conflicts within power structures. And we are going to see conflicts everywhere we look. In the battle to transition from fossil fuels to green energy, in the David and Goliath battles between communities and developers, between trade unions and big business and big bosses, between citizens and vested interests. So politics is necessary because we need to be able to use the levers of structural politics, governments, budgets, laws, to get the widespread and all-encompassing action we need to see if we are to address the climate emergency all of us know we face. But alone, politics is not sufficient. Any democratic system, and we want to maintain our democracy, the alternative I don't think bears thinking about, but we have to maintain our democracy and build support for action. The political decisions that need to be taken on climate action need public support and public buy-in. Now, sometimes politicians say this as a way of passing the buck, of transferring responsibility away from themselves and towards individuals, towards citizens. It's always the individual's fault for not behaving or acting appropriately if and when something goes wrong. And yes, we see that regularly in public policy. How many of us think that eating at least 5 portions of fruit and veg a day is important for our health, will keep us healthy? If we become unhealthy, it's because we've not done what we were told to do. Even though we know, and there's substantial evidence for this, we know the main determinant of health is poverty, not whether you eat 5 portions of fruit or veg a day. But that transference of responsibility from the state, from the structures of society to the individual is that transfer, that abdication of responsibility. I'm not talking about that when I'm talking about citizens being engaged with and part of our democratic processes. So I'm not suggesting that politics or politicians divest themselves of responsibility. Far from it. I'm saying we need to work together to create the case for change and then make that change happen, make the structures amenable to the changes that need to take place. And we need to do this on multiple fronts, but climate action is arguably the most pressing. To take an example from the right, if I may, after the financial crash in 2008, the right, or business as usual, was extremely successful in convincing people that the crisis caused by over-speculation in the financial sector was in fact caused by spending money on public services, by waste and inefficiency in the public sector. It was completely wrong to say that nurses and teachers caused the financial crisis, but because of the right's control of and influence in the media, they were able to convince everyone, or nearly everyone, that a crackdown on public services was necessary, that austerity was necessary. And we're still paying the price for that today. Now, we on the left and in the climate movement do not have mainstream media on our side. And we certainly don't have the deep pockets of big oil or big pharma on our side. But we have each other. We have citizens, each and every one of us here this evening, to make the case for climate action. We have to have politics working with the climate movement and the climate movement working with politics, or at least those politicians that are interested in and care about creating a survivable future. It is vital that the case for climate action, indeed for environmental action, has both push from its citizens and pull from decision makers. Too often we end up in a discussion about whether we should either push or pull. We in fact need to do both and have both all the time. To take an example from our own movement. For years and years, since 1999 in fact, for 25 years in Scotland at least, Greens have done the hard work of advocating for environmental and climate action in Parliament. We've got some good laws, but little tangible, effective action. cue some determined young people and other activists, the actions of Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future. They were what galvanized public opinion and saw positive words in politics become more common, more understood, more supported, even some political action, much more than previously. I remember speaking to a large group of climate strikers outside Parliament shortly after my election in 2021. It was clear that they had done really important work in shifting, not us in Parliament, but the broader public, shifting support in their communities, in their neighborhoods, at their schools, in their families, shifting support, shifting understanding, educating each other about what was going on. They had done more work in shifting the public and therefore the political debate on the climate, arguably, than Greens had done in then 22 years in Parliament. Now, those 22 years weren't wasted. They laid some of the groundwork, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough just to have politicians making the case. We then saw our then First Minister declare a climate emergency. We saw the Scottish Government take seriously legal changes required to see better insulation in our building standards, for example. We saw the largest party in Scotland for the first time concede that maximum extraction of fossil fuels was no longer a viable future for our country. All of us collectively did that. And I think we need to remember that power we have. It was ordinary citizens working with political forces that made that happen. So I see my job as a politician to do this, to make sure my door is always open for those conversations, but also to do whatever I can to ensure we are using the parliamentary tools available to us to deliver the kinds of changes we need to see. I want to make sure that what has happened in England, the authoritarian crackdowns to ban climate protests or toxify simple safeguards like low emission zones and 20-minute neighbourhoods, to make sure those things cannot and do not happen here. We must ensure the popular movement for climate has the freedom to express itself and be heard. Because, and I don't need to tell any of you this, we have to speed up action, both on climate mitigation and adaptation. And none of it is inevitable. We are in a dangerous place in Scotland at the moment. There is a real risk that the difficulties that the Scottish Government has been experiencing will be put down not to their own performance and lack of ambition or focus, but to the kinds of progressive policies associated with the Butte House Agreement and the Scottish Greens. The Greens will be blamed for things not going right. There might be a move to tack away from things like decarbonising heat and move away from a genuine just transition plan, creating genuine just transition plans for all of our industrial clusters. We might see a reinvigoration of support for road building, for support for fossil fuel businesses and the like. So I believe we need a series of really serious interventions by the progressive movement, by all of you, all of us. It's not your fault that the Scottish Government has made heavy weather of getting things done, but there will be a concerted effort by those who want to continue fossil fuel extraction to use their position and the current political crisis to their own ends. So what are the things that we need to do? What do we need to focus on? The political and economic systems we have do not make cooperation and collaboration easy. Community voices are often marginalized, if not excluded altogether. Trade union voices are seen within quite a narrow framework of immediate pay and conditions, negotiations and discussions. And politicians, some, not all, but politicians are often afraid of rocking the boat, of upsetting their funders and supporters. But we have choppy waters ahead, so rocking boats is going to be inevitable. I know Jean will cover some of the community elements when he talks about St. Fittick's, and that's exactly the kind of community activism and movement building that can act as a push for the political system, the political structures to act effectively. We heard at the start about NESCAN. Get along to the community day on Saturday if you can, to be part of wider discussions on this. Because we need to be engaging with each other. We need to be engaging with workers through trade unions, if they have them, through other mechanisms, if not. Workers, communities, These people, you, must be at the center of the transformations we need to see in our economy, in our society, and in the ways in which we engage with and use our different environments. Let's not leave it up to the structures of the status quo, because they have not delivered for any of us. I know that our political system isn't perfect. Far from it. It doesn't properly reflect the society that it seeks to represent. Young people, people of color, other marginalized or vulnerable groups. It is overly influenced by those who favor the status quo, favor and benefit from the status quo. Representative democracy has its limits, which is one of the many reasons I favor and have worked hard to support participative and deliberative forms of democratic engagement and decision-making. Because we have to use whatever we have available to us, our voices, our bodies, our financial clout as consumers, to make clear to each other and to our politicians what our priorities are. Talk to each other, to your neighbors, to the people at the bus stop, in the supermarket queue. Don't let the alienating forces of the economic system that we have prevent us from building community wherever we are, whether those are geographic communities or communities of interest. Pester the politicians that represent you, not me. You don't need to pester me. Pester the others. Pester the politicians that represent you at every level of government, not just your local councillors or your MSPs. And you have several MSPs, not just one or two. Pester all of them, apart from me. Pester your MPs as well, because we need action at the UK government level. There are constraints on what we can do in Scotland because of the devolution setup. And in that pestering, make it clear that you're not just passive cogs in the status quo machine, but active agents who demand change. Some of them won't understand what you're talking about. Some of them will be actively antagonistic, but persist. Try and make them understand, educate them, make them understand what matters to you. Because politics is the vehicle, the imperfect vehicle, but it is the vehicle we have to get the regulation, the legislation, and other changes of structures and systems we need to deliver climate action and the associated economic and social transformations required. I'm a reluctant politician in many ways. I'm probably even an even more reluctant party politician. But I believe politics is necessary, if not sufficient, to deliver the mechanisms, the pull mechanisms, the things we need to create change in a democratic society. It's not sufficient, but we have to harness the political structures and power we have from those in politics and the push from the social movements. And on that note, I'm really looking forward to hear what Jean has to say on community and social movements. Thank you very much.